I'm delighted that you have a show because you're fresh, you're funny, you're great. And I want you to know something. From my heart, I never liked you.
I'm delighted that you have a show because you're fresh, you're funny, you're great, and I want you to know something from my heart. I never liked you. Don Rickles was not merely a comedian. He was regarded as a true assassin on stage, a man capable of delivering barbs that were both charming and razor-sharp and making all of Hollywood simultaneously tremble in fear and burst into laughter. Yet behind those explosive waves of laughter lay a bitter truth. There were faces he harbored a deep, marrow-deep hatred for people he could never bring himself to forgive. As he entered the twilight of his life, Rickles suddenly chose to unveil a secret he had kept hidden for decades. A blacklist powerful enough to send shockwaves. On that list were names such as an incompetent figure who had managed to step straight into politics purely by luck, a movie star worshipped and glorified far beyond actual talent, and even a once close friend whose career to Rickles' dismay was directly entangled with the dark underworld of the mafia. The haunting question remained: why had Rickles stayed silent for so many decades? And what was it that finally drove him to lift the veil of truth, choosing to expose everything during the very final days of his life? Don Rickles began to shine in the 1950s and 1960s, the era when Las Vegas was rising to become the entertainment capital of the United States. With a fiercely aggressive and uncompromising comedic style, he quickly asserted his place, becoming one of the most prominent comedians in the land of the stars and stripes. For decades, Rickles was a regular guest on high-profile talk shows, most notably The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, where he never hesitated to fire shots at any celebrity sitting beside him. The nickname Mr., the warmth given to him by the public, might have sounded affectionate at first, but in truth, it was biting irony on stage. Rickles was anything but warm. He was willing to dissect everything: appearance, race habits, and even careers with blades of satire as sharp as steel. And yet, paradoxically, it was precisely that graceful cruelty that drove audiences wild. While the very victims of his attacks still found themselves laughing and accepting the jabs, Rickles passed away in 2017 at the age of 90, leaving behind a brilliant legacy in the history of American comedy. However, behind that illustrious image lay a truth few ever knew. Not everyone he turned into a punchline on stage was simply a target for amusement. There were certain names that Rickles truly despised down to the bone, and every mocking remark aimed at them carried the weight of a real dagger. 1. Clint Eastwood, a flashy but hollow icon. While most of Don Rickles' victims came from the political world or were fellow comedians, Clint Eastwood was a very different case. He was one of the rare film stars who became one of Rickles' favorite targets. To Rickles, Eastwood was nothing more than a quiet actor with monotonous one-note performances, and yet somehow he was hailed as the ultimate iconic man of Hollywood. On the Las Vegas stage, Rickles once delivered a brutal jab. "Clint, you've got two expressions. One is a frown and the other is an even deeper frown, and that's enough to make you a Hollywood legend." The audience roared with laughter while Eastwood, known for being tight-lipped and stern, merely curled his lips into a cold smile. But to Rickles, that very reaction only reinforced his point. Eastwood was not truly a good actor, just a face who knew how to frown at the right time. Rickles repeatedly stressed that Eastwood's career was nothing but a joke. He sneered. If he had been born with a smile as wide as Sinatra's, he'd be selling tickets at a carnival instead of sitting in a director's chair. Or Hollywood turned a lanky, quiet guy into a Western hero. In reality, Clint is only good at one thing: staring until his opponent walks away out of sheer boredom. In Rickles' eyes, this was an injustice to genuinely talented actors who had been overlooked and forgotten by Hollywood. Yet, Eastwood seemed not to care much at all. That very indifference made Rickles even more irritated, prompting another biting remark. "Clint, if you get any colder, people are going to mistake you for a freezer." Although neither man ever openly admitted to hating the other, Eastwood knew that every time Rickles showed up, his name would inevitably be dragged out as material for ridicule. And every time Eastwood kept that stone-faced look of his, Rickles found fresh fuel to unleash another stinging barb. If Clint Eastwood in Rickles' eyes was nothing more than a hollow monument of Hollywood, then the next person on his list would be an entirely different story. 2. Dean Martin, the suave icon who hid the nature of an alcoholic. Dean Martin, the indispensable right-hand man of the Rat Pack, was the figure Don Rickles most delighted in mocking. In Rickles' eyes, Martin was the perfect illustration of an entertainer who relied solely on flashy appearances and exhausted jokes rather than truly sweating and working hard for the sake of art. Right in the middle of Las Vegas performances, Rickles once bluntly labeled Martin Vegas's high-class drunk. The audience burst into laughter. Yet everyone knew Rickles was striking directly at the carefully crafted image Dean Martin had worked so hard to build, an image of a gentleman with a whiskey glass constantly in hand, singing while teasing women as though life itself were nothing more than an endless party. Rickles despised that image. To him, Martin was nothing more than a lazy man gifted with natural charm, a sweet voice that was never polished to true excellence, acting that was only passable at best, but all cleverly masked under a playful, spontaneous persona. Instead of practicing and honing his craft, Martin would simply hold a drink smile and let the audience delude themselves into believing they were witnessing a born talent. Rickles often ridiculed Martin to his face with biting lines. "Dean, you're not singing. You're just yawning in tune. Or, you owe more of your success to drinking than to singing. If Las Vegas ever ran out of whiskey, your career would collapse." What irritated Rickles more than anything was that Dean Martin was adored by the world. At the time, Martin was the very soul of the Rat Pack, the powerhouse group of entertainers who dominated Las Vegas. While Rickles had to struggle immensely to build his career from the ground up, Martin needed only to drop a single quip and the entire hall would erupt with laughter. There were nights when Rickles' jabs at Martin went so far that the audience was left in shock. "Dean, you're so drunk that if the applause went on for just one more minute, you'd think you were in a bar and order another drink." Even in his final days, Rickles still mentioned Dean Martin as one of the names that made him angry to the core. To Rickles, Martin embodied the type of entertainer he hated the most: superficiality being glorified as genuine value and laziness being celebrated as if it were true talent. But Rickles did not stop at mocking those who lived off alcohol. In his view, there was yet another famous figure who deserved even harsher condemnation. 3. Ronald Reagan, an untalented icon who still rose to power. In the 1960s, before Ronald Reagan stepped into politics and became president, he was merely a mid-level actor, often appearing in small clubs. And it was in those very places that Don Rickles found one of his favorite prey. In Rickles' eyes, Reagan embodied everything. He despised a man without talent who only knew how to smile and recite lines like a machine. Every time Reagan appeared, Rickles seemed to gain new fuel for attack. He once spat out a caustic remark: "Ronnie, you acted so badly that Hollywood had to ship you off into politics." Reagan was famously calm, but those barbs clearly irritated him. Backstage, he once confided to a close friend that Rickles didn't know when to stop. The relationship between the two men was always taut like a drawn string. Rickles saw Reagan as a master of fakery, while Reagan regarded Rickles as nothing more than a loudmouthed clown, skilled only at making noise. When Reagan officially became president of the United States in 1981, Rickles still did not pass up the chance to attack him live on national television. "Mr. President, I still remember you in those awful movies. It's a miracle that America chose a big actor to lead the entire world." To Rickles, Reagan was the very model of a generation of B-list actors who transformed themselves into A-list political stars. During his comedy acts, whenever Reagan's name was mentioned, Rickles unleashed his fire without hesitation. "Ronnie, even the dog Lassie had more impressive roles than you," or "You're the only president in history I believe could be replaced by an extra." The bitter irony was that the more he was mocked, the more Reagan laughed. He brushed it off as harmless jokes. While Rickles saw Reagan as the embodiment of a disgrace, a man who had failed miserably on screen, yet was glorified by the entire world once he entered politics. Rickles once viciously called Reagan the name that made Hollywood ashamed. And so a paradox became the strangest comedy of the 20th century. The man considered one of the worst actors on screen turned into the finest performer on the political stage. For Don Rickles, Ronald Reagan was merely the first proof that Hollywood could turn a mediocre figure into an icon, and Reagan was certainly not the only case. 4. Frank Sinatra, the king of nightclubs, but an empire built from the underworld. At first glance, Frank Sinatra and Don Rickles seemed to be close friends. Sinatra often took Rickles out to dine at the most luxurious restaurants in Las Vegas, introducing him to the elite and even to the casino bosses. Many people even claimed that without Sinatra's backing, Rickles would have remained just another name tied to small comedy clubs, never rising to become a nationwide sensation. And yet, Sinatra himself became Rickles' #1 victim on stage. In Las Vegas during the 1960s, when the mafia still had a firm grip on the casinos, no one dared to cross Sinatra, a man hailed as the king of music, but also rumored to have deep ties to the underworld. While the entire city bowed its head before his name, only Don Rickles dared to lift his chin and mock him outright. "Frank, if it weren't for the mafia, you'd be nothing more than a second-rate lounge singer." The room instantly fell silent. Many feared Rickles would be dragged backstage and taken care of that very night. But in complete contrast to those fears, Sinatra burst out laughing, clapped his hands in approval, and cheered. As a result, Rickles became the only entertainer who could insult Sinatra to his face and still live to tell the tale. Deep down, Don Rickles both admired and despised Frank Sinatra. In his eyes, Sinatra was the clearest example of the illusion of power. His naturally gifted voice was undeniable, but the legendary aura he carried was built upon the shadow of the mafia and shady connections lurking behind the curtains. Rickles loathed the kind of success that was propped up by power and influence rather than pure talent. That was why he never hesitated to tear away the glittering robe of his friend right in front of the crowd. Sinatra has always responded with booming laughter and applause in a show of generosity. But behind that smile, no one could ever know whether it was genuine magnanimity from the king of nightclubs or a soothing anger buried deep hidden in a sparkling glass of whiskey. And if Frank Sinatra was the close friend marked by contradiction, then within that glamorous circle of Las Vegas, Rickles reserved his scorn for yet another figure someone celebrated as a symbol of charm, but who in his eyes was nothing more than the embodiment of decadence and drink. 5. Bob Hope, the man who borrowed laughter to hide deception. In Don Rickles' eyes, Bob Hope, the celebrated comedy icon of America, was the embodiment of everything he despised in the art of comedy. Too sweet, too polished, and far too artificial. Rickles once bitterly remarked with biting sarcasm, "Bob Hope is so funny that I fell asleep even before he managed to step onto the stage." While Hope always chose safe jokes that pleased the masses, Rickles believed that true comedy had to be sharp, direct, and daring enough to touch raw truth. Terex Hope was nothing more than a perfect host, someone who knew how to make the audience laugh just enough, but who would never dare to cross the line of safety. That was not real art. It was nothing more than an industrial product prepackaged for easy consumption. Rickles never hesitated to openly mock Bob Hope with brutal stabs. "Bob, you've never made anyone uncomfortable, but honestly, you've also never made anyone laugh out loud either. Or you're so safe that if one day you went to heaven, even the angels would just yawn out of boredom." What Rickles despised most was Hope's absolute cleverness in maintaining a long-lasting career. In Rickles' view, Hope had turned comedy into a sugary syrup so artificial that anyone could swallow it easily without ever having to think. While Rickles embraced risk, digging into pain and stripping away the truth, Hope chose instead to flatter the audience, delivering a brand of humor that was polished, clean, and sparkling, but completely lacking in any edge. On one occasion, Rickles sneered venomously, "Bob Hope is the Disneyland version of comedy. Beautiful, shiny, but without a trace of truth." And in Don Rickles' Blacklist, Bob Hope always held a special place as the ultimate pretender, the man who turned laughter into harmless merchandise, using it to cover up all the edges, all the honesty, and all the pain that art was meant to confront. To Rickles, Bob Hope's very existence was an insult to true comedy. He saw Hope as living proof of a Hollywood addicted to deceit, enamored with safety, and satisfied with mediocrity. That was why, even in the final days of his life, Rickles still often mentioned Bob Hope as one of the names that irritated him the most. A legend in the eyes of the public, but nothing more than a dull ghost in his own. And the story did not end there. If Bob Hope was the Disneyland of comedy too flashy and too artificial, then American television of that era certainly had no shortage of other icons that made Don Rickles bristle with irritation. 6. Johnny Carson. A television legend, but was his talent truly worthy? Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Johnny Carson was arguably the most powerful figure on American television. He was hailed by the public as the king of late night, a man who could make millions laugh every evening with nothing more than a simple raise of his eyebrow. Yet through the bitter eyes of Don Rickles, Carson was nothing more than a bland host, someone who existed thanks to scripts rather than through genuine spontaneity. Even though Carson had given Rickles many opportunities to shine, that professional camaraderie could never erase the disdain Rickles felt toward him. On stage, Rickles once openly mocked him. "Johnny, you're so charming that when your wife walked out, the audience didn't even notice." The studio erupted in laughter and live air trickles pressed further. "Johnny, you're so serious that if an accident happened, you'd turn it into a news report instead of a laugh." Or "You're no comedian, Johnny. You're just a host lucky enough to hold on to the longest running chair in television history." What irritated Rickles the most about Carson was his complacency. In Rickles' view, Carson always locked himself inside the safe zone, saying only just enough, never daring to break the mold to truly surprise his audience. Carson was indeed a master at controlling the atmosphere, but Rickles saw it as nothing more than a stage delusion, a way of deceiving the public into believing he was the king of comedy when in reality he was only the king of the script. Behind the scenes, Johnny Carson was notorious for being reserved and difficult to approach. Don Rickles once bitterly quipped, "Johnny, you're so closed off that even your own shadow doesn't want to talk to you." Between the two existed a kind of bitter friendship. Carson needed Rickles to generate explosive laughter for his show, while Rickles needed Carson as the perfect backdrop to fire off his sharpest jabs. But the more they worked together, the more Rickles grew to despise him. To Rickles, Carson was nothing more than an empty shell, a legend manufactured by studio lights rather than by true stagecraft. And that is why in his final blacklist, Don Rickles made sure to include Johnny Carson's name, a professional colleague, a television icon, but in his eyes forever, the dullest host in the history of American comedy. However, American television did not produce only kings. It also gave rise to queens' faces celebrated for their sharp wit and biting edge, but who in Rickles' eyes were nothing more than irritating thorns. 7. Joan Rivers, the queen of insults, or just a bitter thorn in Don Rickles' eyes. In the world of American comedy, Joan Rivers was widely known by the title, the Queen of Sharp Tongues, biting caustic and completely unafraid of offending anyone. Yet, it was precisely that style that made her one of Don Rickles' favorite targets. If Rickles was called the king of straight-up insults, then Rivers was dubbed the queen of tearing into people. And her simultaneous presence on the stage felt like direct competition, something Rickles was never willing to swallow easily. From the very first time they stood together on a Las Vegas stage, Rickles sensed immediately that Joan Rivers was not on the same wavelength as him. In his eyes, she simply relied on venom to shock her. Audience without the finesse required to keep a careful balance between insulting and making people laugh. For that reason, Rickles often turned Rivers into his priority target with biting jabs such as Joan. If you were any uglier, Vegas would put up a permanent ban sign at every entrance for you. The crowd roared with laughter, but Joan Rivers' face flushed red. To Rickles, it wasn't just a harmless joke. It revealed his genuine disdain. He believed Joan used her appearance and her surgically altered mouth to draw attention rather than possessing any true depth of artistry. And Rickles didn't stop there. In show after show, he continued to fire away Joan. "I don't need a mirror to put on makeup. She looks in the mirror just to insult herself. Or she's had so much plastic surgery that if the power ever went out, her whole face might collapse like a malfunctioning computer system." The audience laughed themselves breathless, but everyone could see that this was more than a simple exchange of jokes. It was an unspoken duel between two masters of insult comedy, one already enshrined as a legend and the other fighting to establish herself as the new queen of the sharp tongue. Naturally, Joan Rivers refused to sit quietly. Backstage, she once countered with a razor-edged comeback. "Don Rickles isn't Mr. Warmth, he's Mr. Acid. Stay near him too long and your soul might just melt away." That remark quickly spread and fueled heated discussions. The tension between them became a hot topic. Two comedians wielding the same weapon yet despising one another for what each believed was the other's corruption of the craft. To Don Rickles, Joan Rivers embodied clumsy imitation. He detested the way the public praised her as a female version of himself because he firmly believed Rivers had reduced insult comedy to crude, graceless blows that tarnished the very face of the genre. To audiences, Joan Rivers was a genuine queen of comedy. But in Rickles' eyes, she was nothing more than a noisy shadow. Someone who built her fame on venomous words rather than ever achieving the elegance that true insult comedy required. And if Joan Rivers, in Rickles' view, was the queen of insults who dragged down the reputation of insult comedy, then Hollywood still had another clown he despised even more, a figure adored by the world, but whom Rickles saw only as a spectacle of ridiculousness, irritating to the eye and unbearable to the mind. 8. Jerry Lewis, the noisy clown in Don Rickles' eyes. During the 1950s and 1960s, Jerry Lewis was regarded across the world as a rare phenomenon. With his mischievous face, high-pitched voice, and exaggerated physical comedy, he made audiences double over with laughter and slapstick films. Hollywood hailed Lewis as a comedy genius, while the French press went so far as to place him on the same level as Charlie Chaplin. Yet, in Don Rickles' eyes, all of those accolades were nothing more than a misguided act of worship. Rickles never saw Lewis as a genius. He considered him merely a performer, pandering to audiences with cheap antics. Rickles' true comedy had to be direct, honest, and willing to profit from pain and expose the truth. And Jerry Lewis? All he had to do was shout trip over himself or pull a foolish face, and the crowd would erupt in shrieks of laughter. Before thousands of spectators, Rickles once delivered a venomous jab. Jerry doesn't perform comedy. Jerry just yells and hopes the audience thinks it's funny. That remark cut like a knife, striking directly at the slapstick style Lewis had worked so hard to build. In Rickles' view, Lewis's spasmodic gestures and distorted facial expressions resembled nothing more than a cheap carnival where laughter was bought with exaggeration rather than wit or intelligence. Rickles piled on with more scathing remarks. Jerry Lewis makes children laugh, but adults, they just feel exhausted. Or he's the reason I despise Hollywood comedies from the 1950s. What irked Rickles most, however, was the blind adoration from France. When the Parisian press proclaimed Lewis a genius, Rickles sneered, "If the French think Jerry Lewis is a genius, then they probably also believe snails are pizza." In the final years of his life, when reflecting on his career, Don Rickles still mentioned Jerry Lewis with an unmistakable bitterness. On his personal blacklist, Lewis stood as a glaring example of a harsh truth. Not every legend is synonymous with art. Sometimes what the public glorifies is nothing more than absurdity dressed up and paraded as greatness. 9. Lucille Ball, the queen of sitcoms, or just a fragile porcelain figurine in Don Rickles' eyes. In the 1950s and 1960s, Lucille Ball was celebrated by audiences all across America as the queen of sitcoms. With I Love Lucy, she not only transformed the entire landscape of television, but also became the ultimate symbol of an entire era, one in which the laughter of families echoed inside every home. To the public, Ball embodied the very essence of charm, humor, and immortality. Yet for Don Rickles, all that praise was nothing more than a sugary shell covering up the truth. In his eyes, Lucille Ball was never a goddess of comedy, but merely a woman repeating the same gestures until they became boring. Rickles once spat out a biting remark, "Lucy, if you frowned less and fell down more, the whole country would call it art." The entire room erupted in laughter, but behind the joke lay genuine contempt. Rickles believed that Ball relied only on the same tired tricks, distorted facial expressions, shrill and piercing screams, and exaggerated pratfalls. All of it is nothing more than a way to deceive the audience into thinking it was talent. To him, I Love Lucy was not a masterpiece, but an assembly line formula endlessly recycled week after week. Rickles once mocked her openly on live television, declaring, "Lucille, you make America laugh." But I'll bet the second the TV turns off, everyone realizes they've just been laughing at a spinning plate. In his view, Paul was worshipped as a sitcom saint simply because American audiences craved a safe, agreeable icon, someone non-threatening, easy to digest, free from sharp edges or painful truths, and she delivered exactly that. What infuriated Rickles most was not Ball's supposed lack of talent, but the way the public sanctified this endless repetition as if it were the peak of artistry. With a bitter smirk, he once sneered, "Lucille Ball isn't the queen of sitcoms. She's the queen of copying herself week after week until the entire country forgot what real comedy even was." In his notorious blacklist, Rickles pointed to Lucille Ball as the clearest proof of a bitter reality. Not every legend is born of creativity. Sometimes they come only from indulging the audience with safety, predictability, and immutability. And for Rickles, that was the greatest betrayal of comedy as an art form. What weighed most heavily on the public's mind was a single question. Why did Don Rickles, the man who had spent a lifetime hurling venomous words directly at Frank Sinatra, Ronald Reagan, or Clint Eastwood, choose to keep his blacklist hidden for decades? And why did he wait until the very end of his life at nearly 90 years old to finally reveal the truth? The answer lies in Rickles' very nature. On stage, he was Mr. Warmth, a man who insulted mercilessly yet still managed to make the audience laugh. Offstage, however, he understood the razor-thin line between a harmless joke and a genuine accusation. In Las Vegas during the 1960s, a single misplaced word aimed at the wrong powerful figure could be enough to make a comedian disappear overnight. Rickles had walked that tightrope with Sinatra and survived only thanks to the mob boss's approving applause. He knew that openly admitting hatred in real life was not comedy. It was a battle that could destroy his career. That is why Rickles chose silence, because his career needed laughter, not enemies. He understood clearly that once the blacklist was revealed, it would cease to be art and instead turn into personal vendetta, sparking controversy and even genuine danger. For years, Rickles transformed his contempt into material for the stage, mocking Reagan, ridiculing Dean Martin, skewering Bob Hope. But all of it remained public jokes, carefully cloaking his true feelings. Yet as time passed, the burden of silence grew heavier. By the end of his life, Rickles had nothing left to lose. With no more stage lights, no more audiences waiting for laughter, he was forced to confront himself and the bitterness he had hidden for so long. To Rickles, that list was not merely the people I despised, but a damning indictment of an entire entertainment industry that he saw as artificial, unjust, and worshipping the wrong idols. He revealed the list because he wanted the truth to be recorded, a truth no longer masked by laughter. These were no longer jokes, but final confessions. That after all the applause and thunderous laughter Don Rickles still carried within him, names he believed represented deceit, laziness, and hollow glorification. Perhaps only when old age had stripped away everything else did he finally have the courage to admit he had lived his entire life with thorns lodged in his heart. Sinatra, a close friend yet propped up by the mafia. Reagan, a second-rate actor elevated to president. Dean Martin, a booze-soaked gentleman adored by millions. Clint Eastwood, a stone-faced man turned legend. Bob Hope, sweet but false. Johnny Carson, the uninspired king of scripts. Jerry Lewis, the clownish buffoon, worshipped as a genius. For an entire lifetime, Rickles turned hatred into art. He hid it beneath the guise of humor, firing barbs at everyone so audiences would laugh until their sides hurt, living as though he truly hated no one. But behind every burst of laughter lingered the bitterness he never voiced. Only at the very end, when there was nothing left to lose, did Rickles allow those emotions to stand bare in their rawest form. A blacklist stark venomous, stripped of the protective layer of comedy. No longer jokes to make people laugh, but confessions that left listeners shuddering. That list was not simply a collection of names Don Rickles despised. It was an indictment of an entire entertainment industry rife with hypocrisy and injustice. It was the final sigh of a man who had spent his life under the stage lights, yet in his heart had never ceased to scorn the false idols propped up by blind worship. And so, in the final days of his life, Don Rickles was no longer Mr. Warmth. He returned to his rawest self, Don Rickles, bitter and unflinching, no longer needing insults to coax out laughter, but simply speaking the truth that throughout his life, he had lived with thorns, and even in his final moments, they had never disappeared. Perhaps that bitterness itself was his truest confession across an entire career. But once the names on the blacklist were laid bare, what remained was not just scorn, it was also a lingering question. In the end, what did Don Rickles leave behind for the world? Apart from those cutting, merciless blows, in the end, all secrets can be summed up in a single word: legacy. Don Rickles' legacy does not lie in fleeting jokes that vanish along with the laughter, but in how he redefined the very essence of American comedy. Before, Rickles' comedy largely revolved around safe scenarios, easy stories designed to keep audiences comfortable. But once he arrived, people realized that laughter could erupt from raw truth from the thorny realities no one dared to confront. Rickles carved out an entirely new path for insult comedy, stretching from the stages of Las Vegas and New York to the rebellious figures who shook national television. What surprised many was the man Rickles was in real life. In stark contrast to his image as a verbal assassin on stage, he was a gentle soul devoted to his family, loving toward his wife and children, and across a career spanning decades never tainted by scandal. Friends recalled that after unleashing his biting tirades on stage, Rickles was often the first to step down, extend a hand, embrace warmly, and offer thanks. That paradox was the secret to his allure, a warm heart hidden beneath a caustic shell. Rickles also left his mark on film and television, from a supporting role in Run Silent, Run Deep 1958 to the series CPO Sharky, to voicing Mr. Potato Head in the Toy Story franchise, which introduced his name to younger generations. Yet above all, it was those nights in Las Vegas, where he held the microphone and faced the world head-on, that truly illuminated his brilliance. Rickles' legacy was not confined to the art of ridicule. It was also a philosophy that sometimes the most difficult truths need to be delivered through laughter. He proved that when delivered with charm, even the harshest insults could become a form of release, allowing audiences to laugh at the very falsehoods and vanities surrounding them. Perhaps that is why Rickles only chose to reveal his bitter blacklist at the very end of his life. Not to spread hatred, but to ensure people understood behind every burst of laughter lay the truth. And behind the truth was a man who had lived fully through the weapon of his wit. Don Rickles was not just a comedian. He was living proof of an artist who dared to transform bitterness into laughter, who dared to say the things the world preferred to ignore. For nearly 7 decades, Rickles never bowed to anyone. Not Sinatra, not Reagan, not Hollywood, nor the sweet polished standards audiences expected. Every time he stepped on stage, he carried only one principle: the truth must be exposed, and laughter must serve as the scalpel to cut through deceit. And yet, Rickles was also a man of contradictions. He could mock the entire world without restraint, but at home, he was tender with his family. On stage, he was the Las Vegas assassin, but offstage, he was remembered as a loyal friend. He ridiculed legends, but eventually became one himself. When Rickles passed away in 2017, Hollywood lost more than a comedian. The world lost a mirror reflecting unvarnished truth, exposing both the glory and the hypocrisy of the entertainment industry. His legacy was not built on blockbusters or unforgettable roles, but on a style no one else dared to replicate. A style of uncompromising honesty, transforming sharp barbs into an enduring art form. Today, in the memories of millions of fans, Don Rickles is remembered not just for the insults that made audiences laugh until they cried. He has become an indelible echo, a reminder that comedy only survives when it dares to push all the way to the truth. Not through flattery, not through safe laughter, but through a cold, sharp blade that cuts into pain and turns it into release. It was perhaps by being brutally honest to the very end that Rickles achieved immortality. He did not merely make people laugh, he exposed. He did not simply mock, he revealed. And for more than half a century on stage, he demonstrated one undeniable truth. Laughter can be cruel, but it is precisely that cruelty that preserves its honesty. Rickles left this world in 2017, closing a 90-year journey marked by both triumphs and hardships. Yet, his legacy still lives on in the biting lines replayed on talk shows, in the bursts of laughter that resurface when old tapes are played. Each time that laughter rises, it is as though Rickles is still there, sitting on stage, narrowing his eyes, hurling a joke that stuns the room into silence before sending it into an uproar. A legend's life ended, but his laughter has never faded. It continues to reverberate through Hollywood's memory in backstage stories and in the hearts of those who once heard him scold and still erupted in laughter. Don Rickles no longer exists in the flesh, but he endures in the most precious way any artist can as an irreplaceable legacy in the history of American comedy. If the secrets behind the spotlight have already left you astonished, then prepare yourself. Because behind Hollywood's curtains lie countless untold stories, truths capable of shocking you even